This opening chapter from the book of Romans, St. Paul's letter to the Romans, is extremely powerful. And it's a little bit challenging because I'm trying to respond to it in the confines of a daily mass. But I really actually do just want to dedicate a little time and sort of move through it. When Paul begins a letter, his opening line typically will be an umbrella, a macro view of what the entire letter is going to be about. So Romans is going to be about the righteousness of God. So Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for in it is revealed the righteousness of God from faith to faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous by faith will live. But what does it mean to live by faith? Now, we've heard recently in other daily masses his language of like the obedience of faith, which is really language of sonship. So what he's talking about, righteousness comes really through surrender to what God has revealed, where we're not putting up walls in our heart, we're not defying him, we're not struggling against him all the time, which in Israel has been their entire history. So there's no holiness there. Righteousness is the life of God himself. Well, you can't really live if you're not living by faith, which is this big Marian yes to what God is trying to do in your life. And the whole letter to Romans is going to be about what that actually means. But the opening chapter is really a trial scene. It's a prosecution without a defense. There's no rebuttal. And what he's going to get to is essentially that the consequences we see in this life is but an anticipation of what happens at the final judgment. But what goes into all of that? How did we get there? So he starts by saying, the wrath of God is indeed being revealed from heaven against every impiety and wickedness of those who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, I think in our age today, the word wicked too easily becomes interpreted as like a straw man for like this monster individual. And that's too narrow, like the Jeffrey Epsteins, the Adolf Hitlers. Look at it like this: those who simply just give themselves to sin. There are good people in our life who are giving themselves to sin that we wouldn't say are just these total monsters. So when he says wickedness, it's the opposite of those who live by faith, the opposite of those who are truly giving themselves over to God and instead are really giving themselves over to their passions. And that is a lot of people that we would categorize generally as nice, good people, our neighbors, our family members, maybe our spouses. But the problem, and Paul is not mincing his words here, is insofar as they're giving themselves over to sins, the wrath of God is being revealed. Now, why? Why is there a judgment at all? For what can be known about God is evident to them because God made it evident to them. There is no excuse in God's mind. You can't say, well, I didn't go to Catholic school or whatever, because what he's going to say is, evidence of God is embedded in the world itself. He says, ever since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been made able to be understood and perceived in what he has made. That doesn't mean that we're going to go out and just reason from creation that God is three persons in one nature, but we can absolutely reason that there is a God, that there is a creator, there is an intelligibility to the universe and an impossibility that it would exist without a first mover, without somebody putting it into motion and into existence. And the evidence of human history makes that absolutely clear. I mean, Aristotle, Plato, they weren't Christians. They were before Christ. They weren't Jews, but they could reason that some mover was involved in the architecture of the universe. And because of that, no one is exempt from the responsibility of pursuing truth and arriving at the existence of God and then having that truth totally change their life. So he says, as a result, they have no excuse. For although they knew God, they did not accord him glory as God or give him thanks. So instead of yielding, which is a movement of faith and docility, instead they're going to do their own thing, and they are responsible for that. Instead, they became vain in their reasoning, and their senseless minds were darkened. While claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of an image of mortal man. So what he's saying, what happens if we are made in the image and likeness of God? When we don't worship God, when we don't accept him as our creator, when we ignore the truth, or as he says, when we suppress what is evident to us for various reasons, it's not simply that we're just being stubborn. He says, no, you're going to worship something. If you're not worshiping God, then if you're not going to accept that you have been made in God's image and likeness, you are by necessity going to make God in your image and likeness. And this is how people talk. People who have done zero work or exhibited any effort in the spiritual life will often dictate about who God is, and it's always a mirror image of who they really want him to be, rather than how he has revealed himself. And Paul is saying there are consequences to doing that. So therefore God handed them over to impurity through the lusts of their hearts for the mutual degradation of their bodies. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and revered and worshiped the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So last week, I had dinner with a man who was baptized Catholic and was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school. He lives an openly homosexual lifestyle, is pro-abortion, and just there's a whole string of things about his life that are not in accord with the gospel. But he was fascinated by the fact that I was a priest for whatever reason. And so I said, well, why don't we meet? Let's talk about it. Let's have dinner. I'll take you out to dinner. So I bought him dinner. We went to an Indian restaurant and we sat down, and I said, so tell me about your faith, where you're coming from and whatever. And I gave him the opportunity to basically fire away. So he would start firing away, like on issues of life, and he would say, no one should have a say over any other person's body. And I said, okay, so who has a say over the child's body? And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, if no one has a say over anybody else's body and what happens to it, and that's your defense, that's your pro-choice defense, well then what about the child's body? Who has a say over that other than the child themselves? Now he couldn't answer that. Suppressed the truth, changed the direction of the conversation, moved on. So now we're talking about marriage. What is marriage? And I said, well, what do you think marriage is? Because he's pursuing marriage with another man. And I said, well, tell me what you think it is. And in a nutshell, he said marriage is an emotional bond, an intense emotional bond between two individuals who love themselves very much. They want to ratify that in a public format and live that out in a shared domestic life. So really, marriage is just about an intense emotional bond. So I started asking him questions. Well, how do you explain the norms of marriage? Can 4 people have an intense emotional bond? He said, well, that's absurd. I said, is it? Mormonism practiced polygamy forever until about 15 years ago. Middle Eastern cultures have polygamy as a norm. Is it really that extreme? And I said, well, what explains the permanence of marriage? Because emotional bonds, they wax and they wane. And I said, and where does the body come into play in that? You know, how does that, if you're a human being who's a body and a soul, well, intense emotional bonds doesn't leave any room for the body and its role in things. And he couldn't answer anything, so then he just moved on. And what was very obvious was he wasn't interested in the truth, because the minute I started poking little holes in his arguments, he didn't like it and he fled from it and retreated into some other unrelated line of thought. And the consequence of this is that simply he's trying to create a God after his own image and likeness that requires no conversion of life and gives him over to his own passion so that he doesn't have to discipline any part about himself. And that's fine. He has the freedom to do that. And when Paul says the wrath of God is being revealed, the wrath of God that Paul explains in the wider chapter is simply to surrender people to their passions. And there are consequences when that happens and things begin to break down. And in the larger chapter, Paul goes into that. And we've seen that as a society. When we just give in to sin, when we don't have any docility to God, we don't care, we don't worship him, and we worship ourselves, things fall apart. The family breaks down. My own humanity starts to break down. My happiness becomes complicated. I'm divided from within. Communities fall apart. Nations fall apart. God doesn't have to do anything. It comes of its own accord. And I think we can all say we see that. We see that. And so in response, Paul is doing the opposite. He's saying, you know what? I'm not ashamed of the gospel because I really believe it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. The man I was having dinner with, the neighbor who doesn't care anything about God, the family member that we all have who's, making choices that are hurting their relationship with God. The gospel is there for them. God wants to save them. He wants to save me. But it can't happen without a yes. It means we have to stop suppressing the truth and change our posture to saying, Lord, reveal to me who you are. And whatever that means, I am willing to bow.